This is Locally Sourced Spirituality with John Paul, encouraging sustainable and organic spiritual practices. You don't have to go anywhere to find the holy. It's right under your feet.
All right, this is Locally Sourced Spirituality. I'm John Paul, and this is episode 8, Give Me Shelter. I'm local here in Ludington, Michigan for 3 more weeks only, and then I, as I've been saying, am moving to Lansing. And so I'm trying to get in all the things that have shaped me spiritually, that I have done, that I have found value, where I have found the divine. So today I want to talk about shelter in general, and specifically I want to talk about the homeless shelter that is in Ludington, Michigan. The shelter there is named Hospitality in the Name of Christ. And this was formed about 9 or 10 years ago when a man in Grand Rapids who was denied access to the homeless shelters there because he was not qualified to receive aid because he was on the sex offender registry. He was denied access to those ministries. And so this man, in the cold winter of Grand Rapids, crouched down by a van and died. And someone in Ludington heard that story and said, that can't happen here. So they formed Hospitality in the Name of Christ, and the mission was to make sure that no one ever froze to death in Ludington, Michigan. And so they operated an emergency shelter from November 1st to the end of April. And at first, it was housed in various churches. A church would host this ministry for a week or two, and it was known through word of mouth that this place was available, and they would come and they would have a meal. They would have a time of devotions, and they would have a warm place to stay, and in the morning they would have breakfast, and then they would have to go. And then folks would usually go to other warm places that were public that would allow them there. A lot of times the people would go to the public library or to go to a McDonald's. This went on for several years until about 3 years ago when one of the churches invited the ministry to stay there in their church permanently. And so for 3 seasons, they've been in the basement of Bethany Lutheran Church in the south side of the city of Ludington in the 4th Ward. And so this created a stability, and around that stability became new expressions of ways to serve those who were in need. It still went from November to April, but a cadre of pastors came around and would lead devotions 1 night a week each for the whole season. Now, for 2 seasons, I was the Saturday night guy, and this past season, I was the Tuesday night pastor. So I'd come in and give a little talk, a teaching, and lead a discussion. In that time, I would form relationships, and I formed friendships with the guests at the shelter. That's what we call them. We don't want to call people homeless. That's not their identity. People aren't homeless people. People are people who are currently without a home. And so this ministry was administered and ran by Tim and Tammy Martin, and these folks are some of the best people that you'll ever meet. They have a heart for reaching people, for loving people, for empowering people right where they are. And I learned so much from them. They showed me how to welcome someone without judgment. They showed me how to welcome someone and see their brokenness and see the obvious problems in their lives, but not let that be a barrier to a friendship. So that's the shelter. That's what's happening. And now it's further evolving. I don't know what it's going to evolve into, but in this past season, we started a mentoring program where those who were interested, only those who volunteered for the program are going through a very regimented look at their life and their habits and their thought processes and how they make decisions, and how can they make better ones, and they can set goals and maybe move into a different type of lifestyle. It's in the pilot program right now, and I don't know how it's going to look, and that's one of those things that I have to let go. I was at the forefront. I was in the planning stages of all that, and now it's going on without me because I'm going away. And so part of my spirituality is that those things that we start, those things that we initiate, we don't always get to see the fruit of. But it's the experience that I had in that shelter that really shaped me. So let's talk about shelter. Shelter, in its most basic, is just protection from what's outside of us, right? A few days ago here in Ludington, we had a pretty big thunderstorm. In fact, the thunderstorm knocked down a pretty large branch out of a tree and hit my car and dented it all up. On the same night that I had hit a deer with my other car, by the way. But that's neither here nor there. But thunderstorms, it wasn't a big deal to us who were in a house. The thunder was crashing, the lightning was flashing, but we were sitting comfortably at home. We went to bed and didn't think much about the thunderstorm. And this past February, there were severe winter storms. It's deadly here in Michigan in the winter. Yes, it's not as cold as you folks out in the Dakotas or in Minnesota, but it is deadly. But it didn't really slow me or my family down because we have a house. We have good shelter that's insulated. And we have clothes and we have vehicles to get us to where we need to go. We have the protection that we need. Now there's a psalm in the Bible, Psalm 91. It starts off, "You who live in the shelter of the Most High, who abide in the shadow of the Almighty, will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust." So we're saying that God is our shelter, that the divine is our shelter. But is God our shelter in the same way that our clothes and that our house and that our vehicle is our shelter? Well, if we read this psalm literally, it is saying that. If we take it word for word and look at it, it talks about when you go into battle, maybe there'll be thousands who die at your side, your comrades who die, but you'll be protected. And he says, "For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up so that you will not dash your foot against a stone. And you will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot. Those who love me I will deliver. I will protect those who know my name. When they call to me, I will answer them. I will be with them in trouble. I will rescue them and honor them. Long life I will satisfy them and show them my salvation." So there's a lot of promises there. And so those of us who are part of this tradition, who come out of this Jewish tradition, reading the Old Testament, and are now part of the new covenant, the new way, or the way of Jesus Christ, who are Christians, we say, wow, we have these promises. We're going to be protected because we have faith. But then we're pointed to another scripture in the New Testament where it says, well, don't put your Lord God to the test. Well, I say, why not? Why not put it to the test? If you can't live what the scriptures promise, then we shouldn't say it. We should be able to shout out what God does from our own experience. Now, I want to back up a little bit. This psalm, these promises from Psalm 91, I don't read them as promises of future protection. I read them as a praise of what God has done. The psalmist has come this far. The psalmist has been spared. The psalmist has made it through very difficult experiences and is still alive. And I imagine the psalmist is imagining, it's only because of God. It's only because of my faith in the God who saves me that I'm even here. Because under his own power, under his own ability, he shouldn't be alive. And which one of us can't say that? Which one of us has made it through our life making dumb mistakes, doing foolish things where we probably should have been in trouble, or we should have even maybe lost our lives, but somehow we made it through. And we want to give God credit. I think that's more the perspective of the psalmist in this. I don't for a minute think that because I have faith that I can go off to war and that everyone else around me will die, but I'll be spared. Because I know a lot of good and faithful people have died in war. I know a lot of good and faithful people have dashed their foot against a stone. I know a lot of good and faithful people who have died from things like cancer. And it's not because they lacked faith. It's not because they didn't measure up. It's just because this is a dangerous world and bad things happen. But when we do make it through, when we do somehow survive all those things, it is good and it's right to give God thanks and praise for that. And when you do, that's when you start to recognize the holy in your life. But don't confuse your survival with your level of faithfulness, because it's not from us. It's not something that is determined by us. There are people who have lived this life and have known only comfort and privilege. Now, I've never been to war, so I don't know what that's like. I can't presume to know what those folks have gone through. I've never been homeless. I've never been addicted to anything. I've never experienced mental illness. But I've seen all those things. I've been around those who are experiencing homelessness. I've seen their addiction. I've seen how it affects them, how it controls their life. And I've seen the mental illness that they suffer with. And it's not because they lack faith. It's not because they've done something wrong. Now, there are people who will say, I didn't know there was homeless people in Ludington. I didn't know that there was this much heroin in Ludington. I didn't know that there was such a problem with mental illness. And they would say, I didn't know, only after you bring it to their attention or if you bring it up. Otherwise, most people are oblivious to these problems, and people think that their world is fine and good and easy, and that those people, if they would just get their stuff together, that they could live a better life. Well, there are people who have struggled, and there are people who have overcome great obstacles. But the funny thing is, those people who have been through it and have come to a better place in their life, in my experience, those folks are more likely to reach a hand out to help those who are currently experiencing difficulty and challenges in their lives. Then you hear people say things like, well, we don't want to encourage or enable that kind of lifestyle. That's what people who have never struggled say. A few months ago, the Pope was addressing a question about whether or not to give money or resources to the poor because they might spend it on their addictions. And he said, well, that's not for you to decide. The poor need resources. And if you have them, you should give them. That's paraphrasing, of course. So we're in ministry with the poor. And I say that in a very specific way, ministry with them. We're not in ministry to the homeless or to the poor, but in ministry with the poor and those who are experiencing homelessness. And so part of the ministry, or the beginning of the ministry, is to feed them, right? We bring dinner and we bring breakfast, and they get this, quote, free food that they, as some people say, didn't earn. But that's not the ministry. That's not where we find God, in the giving of the food. The giving of the food is a minimum obligation of being a decent human being. The ministry comes after that. When you've met the immediate need, when you've met the basic need of being alive, of shelter and food, then the ministry begins. The interaction, the encounter with the divine begins. Because that's when trust is built. That's when love is expressed. That's when friendships are developed. And then that's when healing begins. And so I go to the shelter once a week through the winter months, or I did. And I would go week after week, bringing a reading from the Bible, a word of hope, a word of caring. At the beginning of the season, there's little trust of me. I'm this pastor that's trying to ram stuff down their throat. But by the end, they understand that I'm not there to convert anyone. I'm not there to change anyone. I'm there just to be a loving presence in the name of Jesus. And so I teach and I guide, and I get some really interesting and sometimes difficult questions during the devotion times. And what I often get challenged on is when we say things that can't really be backed up. Like in Psalm 91, when we say that those who have refuge in God will not get hurt. They'll have all this protection. Well, that's not their experience. They know faithful people that have died. They know faithful people that suffer. They might even have a strong faith themselves, yet they are where they are. And they have a very practical view of spirituality. When they say the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, they get that. They know that the earthly does not yet look like the heavenly. And they know because they live in the most difficult part of it. But then give us this day our daily bread. They depend on other people. They depend on people with resources to hand them food. Otherwise, they would go hungry. In fact, a lot of days they don't have a meal between the breakfast that they get at the shelter and the evening meal that they get at the shelter that evening. Teach about Jesus saying that we should turn the other cheek. And I was challenged on that. One guy said, I can't turn the other cheek or I'll continue to be victimized. And victimized they are. And so we had a discussion about what that meant. We who are privileged, we who are comfortable in this life, we receive these teachings and we apply them in very mild ways and in ways that aren't very challenging to our behavior. But when we are interacting with people who are on the margins, who are struggling, these are contentious teachings. They're difficult teachings. And so when you're in conversation with someone that's on the margins, you have to figure out what it is you actually believe. Do you actually believe that if you have faith, that you can go into war and everyone around you will die, but you'll remain alive? If you believe that and you've experienced that, well then great. But if you haven't experienced that and you don't really believe that, I would suggest that we don't make that claim. We can point to it in the Bible like I'm doing and maybe try to find another interpretation, but I would suggest that we not make claims that we don't truly believe. Because when we do that, when we make claims of things that we don't really believe, then our own credibility comes into question. Jesus, some people say, was homeless. It says in part of the New Testament that he has no place to lay his head. Other people have suggested that his home was in Capernaum. Of course, he was raised in Bethlehem. And he was a friend to Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and he probably stayed there sometimes. And he was a teacher to his disciple Peter, and he might have stayed there at times. But Jesus experienced the things he was talking about. When we approach people on the margins and we see their life, we have to be vigilant of our own lens through which we see them. Do we need them to live exactly like we do? We see them without a home. We see them without a vehicle and without a job. Well, that's what we have. So then the dangerous thing is to say, well, you need to be exactly like me. When in fact, we have to figure out exactly what they need to be, according to their own spirit, according to what God's will is for them. And so I go back to the notion of being in ministry with them and not to them. A couple of summers ago, I invited all of them, actually, at the end of the season, at the end of April, to join me in being in ministry to people who are in need. I just took for granted. I made the assumption that I was not going to categorize them in that group. I invited them to be disciples of Jesus who is called out and to serve those who are on the margins. It doesn't matter how much you have, you can always go out and serve. And so I invited them not to be on the receiving end of people's charity, but on, and not even on the giving end either, but in cooperation with charity so that the needs of the people are being met with the provision that others have given. And so we had a great summer. We started meeting weekly at a laundromat, and we would pray together, and we would help people out with their laundry, and we would do things, and we formed this community where we were assisting each other and providing for each other and making our way through life together. Some lived in a camp in a wooded area in the city of Ludington. Some lived on couches of friends, and others lived out in the woods by themselves, but we would gather together once a week to support each other and see what our needs were. And then a few of those wanted to go further, and so we started a discipleship group. So we'd meet at the library, and we would have coffee and donuts, and we would talk about what it means to grow as a disciple of Christ. And then the next fall came around, and by the end of it, many of the people found homes, found different places to be, but a few went back into the shelter. So we were in ministry together. Needs were being met together. And that's what it means to me to be in ministry with someone. It's allowing people space to use their gifts to meet the needs of others. When you just start handing people stuff and dictating how they need to be blessed, that's just a dependency sort of relationship. But when there's a give and take, when there's a holy space created between you where each of you can use your gifts, then I think that's when we start to experience the divine. That's when we start to experience God's presence with us. And it was a beautiful thing. That fall I was teaching about the story in the Bible about the loaves and the fish, where there was a large crowd that was gathering and following Jesus. And the disciples were saying that, there's all these people here, they're hungry. You need to send them home, send them away so they can get something to eat. And Jesus said, you feed them. He was providing the space. He was giving them the opportunity to serve in their own capacity. Well, one of them said, here's this little boy. He's got some bread and some fish. And then they said, let's start passing that out. And so they gathered the people into groups, and they started passing around the food. And everyone was fed. Thousands of people were fed. And then there was leftovers at the end. Now, I was teaching this at the shelter, and one of the guys, one of the guests, was very skeptical. He's like, no, it didn't happen. It just didn't happen because people would notice when they broke off the bread that another piece would appear. Gets back to that thing about what do we really believe? Do we believe that's what happened? And when someone tore off a piece of bread, it would fill back in? It didn't say that in the Bible. It just said that when they started passing out the food, there was enough for everybody. Now, the miracle could be the hocus pocus of more bread appeared on the loaf as they ripped off more. Or is it that many other people have suggested that when the boy shared his loaves and fish, that his act of generosity inspired others to be generous with what they were hoarding, and then everyone shared, and those who had an abundance still had enough, and those who had nothing had enough. And I suggested that answer to the skeptic, my friend at the shelter, as an explanation of the miracle. And I saw him melt a little bit, and he, rather than argue with me, he said, I can get behind that. So there was a little bit of understanding on his part, because he hears the stories. He grew up as a son of a pastor and in a very literalist kind of tradition. And he was seeing the things, or he was hearing the things that he was being taught, and he didn't see the things being demonstrated in the world as they were taught. He saw the disconnect, and then so he walked away from the whole thing altogether, when the truth wasn't in the literal words, but it was the truth behind what was being taught. Previous times to that same guy, he would challenge me. And I thought that he was just being obstinate. I thought he was just being difficult. And I thought he was just attacking me. So I would leave the shelter sometimes feeling angry. I mean, to be honest, I was frustrated. I'm like, why do I even bother going in there? I take my time, I take my Saturday nights away from my family, and I go in and spend time just to get this garbage. I don't need it. I wanted to avoid it sometimes. But that was only sometimes. And when I started to learn a little about who they were as people, about their story, then I started to understand why they would say the things to me that they did. And when I understood their story, I could have compassion. And I could then share my story with them and then develop that friendship that I have. So we don't need to avoid those who are in need if we feel ill-equipped to help. When we don't feel like we can make a difference, when we feel like we don't have the right thing to give, we don't need to avoid them. What's really needed is a relationship, is a friendship. If someone asks you for $5 and you don't have $5 that you can give, you just say, I can't. But you can still be in relationship with them. Now here's the other side of that. You also don't need to avoid those who are in need even if you are in a position to help. Sometimes we have the thing, we have the word, we have the resource that can help, and we avoid being around people in need because we're afraid to give it up. We're afraid that we're going to lose something in the exchange. And so we think about what we give. Now, there was a situation a couple of years ago where one of the guests needed a vehicle. There was someone I knew that had a vehicle, and he was willing to give the guest the vehicle. But he asked me a really great question. Will this vehicle put an undue burden on this person, on this guest? Meaning, I could give them the vehicle, but then they have to buy gas and insurance and maintain it. Will this be a financial burden on them? And so we talked about that with the person, and we saw the resources, and in fact, it would be a blessing. So he gave this van to this guest. But had that person not been able to meet those requirements, to be able to put fuel in it and to maintain it and to pay for the insurance, well, then the next thing that would have happened is that this guest would have just sold the van for money, and then the blessing wouldn't have been as great. But it was in the relationship that was there. It was in the trust and in that conversation that we were able to figure out that this was going to be a good thing for this person. So we offer relationship. And we don't feel guilty about our success when other people aren't successful in those terms. But we should feel guilty about our success if our success came at the expense of others. If others had to suffer because of our place in this world, well, then we should be guilty of that. We should repent of that. We should change or try to make things right. I heard in an interview somewhere with Peter Rollins, it was great. He was talking about Batman as a villain, how Batman is this very, very wealthy individual who creates an economic environment where he has lots of wealth, and he exploits workers, and then for sport he goes out on weekends and beats up on criminals who are just trying to get by in a economic environment that he himself created. And I'm not saying that this is an accurate depiction of the Batman series, but it's an interesting way to look at that. Are we, or have we contributed to a system where some people are left out? And if we are, then we need to make amends. We need to make corrections. And we need to bring people up. So if you've benefited from an unfair system, it's your responsibility to work to correct the system. So how's it with you today? Can you think of a system? Can you think of a way that you have benefited in this world because of some unfairness? Is there something about you, any position that you hold or status that you have attained that gives you more privilege than someone else? If that has given you any sort of benefit, then it's your responsibility to correct that, to make amends. If we don't correct, if we don't make amends, and we continue to receive the benefits of a status that we didn't earn, but just by nature of being born, well, then we are, by our silence, advocating that very unjust system. So how is it with you today? Do you have shelter? Do you have clothes? Do you have a house? But what about the next things? We hear in one of our favorite Psalms, the 23rd Psalm, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff comfort me. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. Of course, it doesn't mean we're going to live in the church, right? That means we're going to live in the presence of God. Even when we have blessings, we're going to live into God's will so that there's justice, so that there's the kingdom of God coming on earth as it is in heaven. We're going to live in such a way that's honoring to God and taking on God's priorities of lifting up those who are on the margins. And that is how we experience the divine right where we are. Talk to you next time.
Music is provided by Bleed the Water. Check them out on Facebook. Graphic design by Holly Pole Photography. Go to hollypolephotography.com. This has been a John Pole production.